The chamber door closes with a sound that echoes like a tomb being sealed. She is 15 years old. The white linen of her gown is already being unlaced by hands that do not belong to her husband. They belong to witnesses. 6 of them. 8 of them. Sometimes 12. Noblemen. Clergy. Full. They stand in a half circle around the marriage bed, their faces lit by candlelight, their expressions ranging from boredom to anticipation. The girl, now a queen by virtue of vows spoken hours earlier in a language she barely understands, has been told this is tradition. She has been told this is honor. She has been told that her value to her family, to her kingdom, to Christendom itself, depends on what happens in the next hour. The men do not avert their eyes. They are required to watch, to verify, to record. The king, often twice her age, sometimes 3 times, removes his ceremonial robes. This is not a private moment. This is theater. This is policy. This is the machinery of dynastic power made flesh. And when she begins to tremble, when tears stream down her face in silence because she has been taught that a queen does not weep, no one intervenes, because intervention would be scandal. Because her fear is irrelevant compared to the legitimacy of the heir she must produce. This is not an isolated cruelty inflicted by one sadistic monarch. This is not the aberration we tell ourselves it must be. This is ritual. This is law. This is what happened to hundreds of royal women across centuries of European history, and we have filed it away under the soft, forgiving word, tradition. We do not speak of this. We speak instead of grand alliances and political genius. We speak of the marriage that united warring kingdoms, of the brilliant diplomatic strategy that secured peace through royal unions. We construct elaborate genealogies tracing bloodlines through the daughters traded like currency between thrones. We marvel at the pageantry of medieval weddings, at the sumptuous feasts that lasted for days, at the tournaments held in honor of foreign princesses delivered to husbands they had never met. The historical record, written almost exclusively by men who benefited from this system, describes these marriages as triumphs of statecraft. The chronicles use words like alliance, treaty, peace. They describe the bride's beauty, her dowry, the magnificence of her procession into her new kingdom. What they do not describe, what they deliberately obscure behind euphemism and omission, is that these girls were commodities in a market where their bodies were the primary asset and their consent was not merely irrelevant, but conceptually impossible within the legal and theological framework that governed royal marriage. The medieval wedding was not a beginning. It was a transaction finalized, a transfer of ownership ritualized into spectacle. And the wedding night was not an intimate moment between 2 people learning to navigate a new relationship. It was an audit, a public verification, a ceremonial invasion designed to ensure that the machinery of inheritance would function without the contamination of doubt. Consider the architecture of this cruelty. A royal marriage in medieval Europe was constructed on a foundation of deliberate dehumanization disguised as sanctity. The girl, often between the ages of 12 and 16, was legally a child by our understanding but a marriageable woman by the standards of a society that measured female value almost exclusively through reproductive capacity. She was raised from birth to understand that her body was not her own, but an instrument of dynastic continuity. Her education focused not on governance or autonomy, but on obedience, piety, and the performance of dignity under scrutiny. She was taught to move gracefully, to speak softly, to accept without question the will of her father, who would select her husband based on strategic calculation rather than her welfare. In many cases, she would not meet this husband until days or hours before the wedding. In some documented instances, she would not even speak his language. The marriage ceremony itself was a production designed to overwhelm individual will with communal expectation. Hundreds of witnesses. Sacred vows administered by clergy who represented divine authority. Music and procession and the weight of an entire court watching her every gesture. By the time she reached the threshold of the bridal chamber, she had been processed through a ritual machine that left no room for refusal, no language for expressing fear, no exit from the path that had been determined for her before she was born. But it is the bedding ceremony that reveals the full perversion of this system. the full systematic conversion of intimacy into apparatus. After the wedding feast, after hours of public celebration in which the bride and groom were displayed like religious icons, came the moment that medieval chronicles describe with unsettling casualness. The bride was escorted to the chamber by a procession of noble ladies who would ceremonially undress her, removing each layer of her bridal garments while offering prayers for fertility. The groom was likewise escorted by noblemen who undressed him while offering bawdy jokes and explicit instructions. This was called preparation. This was called honor. Then came the witnesses. In France, in England, in the Holy Roman Empire, in Spain, the presence of witnesses at the royal bedding was not merely customary, but often legally required. The reason given was legitimacy. The monarchy depended on certainty regarding succession, and in an era without genetic testing, without any scientific mechanism to verify paternity, the sexual act itself had to be observed, documented, recorded by men whose testimony could stand in court should the legitimacy of an heir ever be questioned. The witnesses would stand in the chamber as the bride and groom were placed in the bed. They would watch as the bed curtains were drawn closed or, in some recorded cases, left partially opened. They would listen. They would wait for the sounds or signs that consummation had occurred. In some kingdoms, the witnesses would demand visual proof. They would inspect the bedsheets for blood, for the supposed evidence of virginity torn, and this linen would then be displayed publicly or preserved in royal archives as a state document. The psychological architecture of this practice is breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Consider what it meant for a teenage girl, already terrified by the prospect of sexual initiation with a stranger, to know that this initiation would be performed before an audience of powerful men whose careers and loyalties depended on what they witnessed. She could not hesitate. She could not refuse. She could not ask for time or privacy or mercy, because the performance was compulsory, and delay itself could be interpreted as scandal. If she showed too much fear, it could be read as resistance, as evidence that she was an unwilling or unsuitable bride, which could jeopardize the alliance her marriage was meant to secure. If she did not bleed, or did not bleed enough, she could be accused of having lost her virginity before marriage, which in the legal framework of medieval Christianity was grounds for annulment, exile, or worse. The presence of witnesses converted the wedding night into a test she could fail, into a spectacle where her pain and fear and violation were not unfortunate side effects, but the very substance of what was being verified. The witnesses were there to confirm that she had been possessed, that her body had been successfully transferred from her father's house to her husband's, that the machinery of inheritance had been set in motion, and the cruelty extended beyond the wedding night itself. The witnesses would discuss what they had seen. They would gossip. They would testify if called upon by courts or councils investigating the legitimacy of royal children. The most intimate details of the queen's body, her reactions, her bleeding or lack thereof, would become matters of state record, preserved in documents that historians can still read today. In some cases, if the bride was too young or too ill to consummate the marriage immediately, the witnesses would return night after night until consummation was achieved and verified. In other cases, if the queen failed to become pregnant within the expected time frame, the bedding ceremony could be repeated, or physicians could be summoned to examine her body in front of court officials to determine whether she was capable of bearing children. Her fertility was not a private matter. It was a national concern, and every aspect of her reproductive function could be investigated, discussed, legislated, and judged by men who wielded the power to dissolve her marriage, destroy her reputation, or send her into exile if she failed to produce the male heir that was the entire justification for her existence as queen. But the witnesses were not the only mechanism of control. The royal wedding night was surrounded by rituals designed to maximize the bride's vulnerability and the king's dominance. In many kingdoms, the bride was required to fast for days before the wedding to purify her body for her husband. She would arrive at the ceremony weakened, lightheaded, more easily overwhelmed by the physical and emotional demands placed upon her. In some traditions, the bride was given wine or herbs intended to relax her, to make her more compliant, substances whose effects ranged from mild sedation to near unconsciousness. This was not framed as drugging but as care, as assistance, as ensuring that the wedding night proceeded smoothly. The language used to describe these practices in medieval texts is revealing. The bride is never described as a participant. She is prepared. She is delivered. She is received. The grammar itself strips her of agency. The king, by contrast, is described in active terms. He claimed. He takes. He consummates. The entire ritual structure reinforces the understanding that the wedding night is something done to the queen, not an experience shared between partners. And then there were the blessings. Before the bride and groom were left alone, or before the witnesses departed, clergy would often perform a blessing over the marriage bed. Prayers would be spoken invoking divine favor on the union, asking God to grant fertility, to ensure the conception of male heirs, to protect the kingdom through the queen's womb. These blessings sound pious in the historical record. They sound sacred. But listen to what they actually accomplish. They convert the sexual act from a human interaction into a holy obligation. They make the queen's suffering, her fear, her physical pain, into a form of service to God. If she resists, she is not merely defying her husband, but defying divine will. If she expresses fear or pain, she is demonstrating insufficient faith. The blessing sanctifies the violation. It makes questioning the ritual equivalent to blasphemy. And because the ceremony was performed by the same clergy who controlled education, who defined sin, who held the power to declare marriages valid or void, there was no authority to which the queen could appeal. The men who blessed the bed were the same men who would later investigate her fertility, judge her worthiness, and potentially testify against her if political winds shifted and her husband desired a new wife. The historical record provides us with fragments of what these women experienced. We have letters. We have testimony from divorce proceedings. We have the rare chronicle written by or about a queen who later gained enough power to speak of her early life. And what emerges from these fragments is a pattern of trauma so consistent, so universal among royal women, that it cannot be dismissed as individual misfortune. Queen Isabella, France, married at 12 to Edward II of England, later described her wedding night in terms that her contemporaries found disturbing enough to record, though the details were softened by scribes, uncomfortable with her candor. Margaret of Anjou, married at 15 to Henry VI, arrived at her wedding already knowing from the whispers of her ladies what the bedding ceremony would entail, and her letters reveal a young woman who understood she was entering a form of sanctioned captivity. Anne of Brittany, married twice to French kings, once at 14 and again at 20, both times subjected to the full apparatus of witnessed consummation, later instituted changes in her own household that suggest a woman trying to create zones of privacy and dignity for younger women that she herself had never been granted. These were not weak women. They were queens who later wielded significant political power. But their power came after. It came despite. It came as compensation for what had been taken from them on their wedding nights and in the years that followed. The bedding ceremony was not the only ritual that transformed the queen's body into public property. After the wedding night came the expectation of pregnancy. And this expectation was not merely hope, but demand backed by the threat of annulment. Medieval queens were expected to become pregnant within the first year of marriage. If they did not, speculation would begin. Physicians would be consulted. The queen's diet, her schedule, her every activity would be scrutinized for factors that might prevent conception. In some kingdoms, the queen's ladies-in-waiting were required to report on the frequency and nature of the king's visits to her chamber, creating a surveillance system that monitored her intimate life constantly. When the queen did become pregnant, her body became subject to even more intense scrutiny. She would be examined by midwives and physicians, often men, who would feel her abdomen, inspect her breasts, make predictions about the sex of the child she carried. If the child was female, disappointment would be expressed openly. If the pregnancy ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, the queen could be blamed. Her piety would be questioned. Her bloodline would be investigated for signs of weakness or curse. And if she failed to produce a male heir after multiple pregnancies, the king's advisors would begin discussing annulment, a process that in the medieval context often meant exile, imprisonment in a convent, or accusations of adultery or witchcraft, designed to justify the king's desire for a new wife who might succeed where the previous queen had failed. Consider what this meant for the queen's understanding of her own body. From the age of 12 or 14, she knew that her worth was measured entirely by her capacity to produce children, specifically male children, and that failure in this capacity could result in disgrace, poverty, or death. She knew that her most intimate experiences would be observed, discussed, and judged by men who had no affection for her, and whose political interests might be served by her failure. She knew that pregnancy was both her duty and her danger, that childbirth in an era without anesthesia or antibiotics killed approximately 1 in 3 women of childbearing age, and that if she died in the process of producing an heir, she would be mourned briefly and then replaced. The medieval queen lived in a state of permanent performance anxiety, where the performance being judged was her biological function. She could not control whether she conceived. She could not control the sex of the children she bore. She could not control whether those children survived infancy. But she would be held accountable for all of it. And the accountability began on her wedding night, in that chamber full of witnesses, where her value as a human being was reduced to the question of whether she bled on command. The system did not arise by accident. It was not a regrettable product of ignorance or superstition. It was designed. Medieval legal scholars and theologians spent considerable intellectual energy constructing the framework that made this apparatus possible. Canon law, the legal system of the medieval church, defined marriage as a sacrament whose primary purpose was procreation. It established that women reached marriageable age at 12, men at 14. It created detailed rules about consanguinity and affinity to ensure that royal marriages could be arranged strategically, without violating incest taboos. It established that consummation was necessary for a marriage to be legally binding, creating the justification for witnessed bedding ceremonies. It defined virginity as a form of property that a bride brought to her marriage, making the inspection of bloodied sheets a rational verification procedure rather than a degrading invasion. The theological framework taught that women's bodies were simultaneously sacred vessels for reproduction and sources of temptation that required constant male supervision. This paradox meant that queens were simultaneously elevated and imprisoned by their fertility. They were too valuable to be ignored and too dangerous to be trusted with autonomy. The secular legal systems reinforced these religious frameworks with inheritance laws that made legitimate male heirs essential to dynastic stability. In an era when kingdoms could be lost or gained through marriage, when the death of a king without a clear heir could trigger civil war or foreign invasion, the queen's womb was genuinely a strategic asset. But the response to this strategic importance was not to protect or honor the queen. It was to surveil her, to control her, to ensure through ritual and law and the constant presence of witnesses that her reproductive capacity served the kingdom rather than her own interests or desires. The bedding ceremony was one component of a larger system designed to eliminate any doubt about paternity, any possibility that a queen might claim a child was the king's when it was not, any chance that personal affection or individual will might interfere with the machinery of succession. And this system was so successful, so thoroughly normalized, that queens themselves often participated in perpetuating it. Older queens would attend the bedding ceremonies of younger queens. They would offer advice on how to endure. They would supervise the undressing. They would inspect the sheets. Because survival within the system often required complicity. Because the alternative to participating was to be marked as strange, as suspicious as a woman who did not understand her place. We have sanitized this history. We have turned it into romance. The modern imagination pictures medieval royal weddings as fairy tales, as love stories between princes and princesses who lived happily ever after in stone castles. We watch television series and films that depict medieval queens as powerful women who navigated court politics with intelligence and grace. And while some of this is true, while some queens did achieve remarkable power, despite the constraints placed upon them, these narratives almost never depict a bedding ceremony. They almost never show the witnesses. They almost never confront the systematic sexual violation that was the entry price for a woman to become queen. And when historians do discuss the bedding ceremony, it is often described in neutral, academic language. A ritual, a custom, A verification procedure. The language flattens the horror. It makes the practice sound like an administrative formality rather than a traumatic assault witnessed by strangers and sanctioned by law and church. We do this because confronting the full reality of what happened requires acknowledging that institutions we still revere, the monarchy, the church, the concept of chivalry itself, were built on the systematic exploitation of women's bodies and the deliberate destruction of their autonomy. The consequences extended beyond the wedding night. Queens who survived the initial trauma often spent the rest of their lives in a form of gilded captivity. They had wealth, status, beautiful gowns, servants who attended their every need. But they had almost no privacy. Their correspondence was monitored. Their visitors were controlled. Their movements were restricted. They could not travel without permission. They could not form independent alliances. They could not express political opinions that contradicted their husbands without risking accusations of disloyalty. And they could never escape the fundamental vulnerability that defined their position. If they failed to produce a male heir, they could be set aside. If they produced a male heir but the king grew tired of them or found a more advantageous alliance, they could be accused of adultery, a crime that in some kingdoms carried the death penalty for queens, though it was rarely punished when committed by kings. Anne Boleyn was executed not because she committed adultery, historians now largely agree, but because Henry VIII wanted a new wife and needed a legal justification for removing Anne. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, but they worked because the system had established that queens existed conditionally, that their right to their position and even their lives depended on pleasing the king and producing heirs, and that failure in either capacity made them disposable. The bedding ceremony itself eventually declined, not because society suddenly recognized its cruelty, but because changing political structures made it less necessary. As monarchies became more bureaucratic, as record-keeping improved, as the concept of the nation-state began to replace the feudal system of personal loyalties between nobles, the need to verify royal consummation through direct observation diminished. By the Renaissance, some kingdoms had reduced the bedding ceremony to a symbolic ritual where witnesses would escort the couple to the chamber, but then depart before consummation. By the Enlightenment, it had largely disappeared from royal practice, though it persisted in some aristocratic families well into the 18th century. But its disappearance did not represent a moral awakening. It represented a change in the technology of control. As surveillance became more sophisticated, as courts developed other methods of monitoring queens and verifying legitimacy, the crude mechanism of the witnessed bedding became unnecessary. The underlying premise, that royal women's bodies were state property to be managed and controlled for dynastic purposes, persisted long after the specific ritual ended. And the silence about this practice is itself part of the violence. When we teach medieval history, we teach about the Crusades and the Magna Carta and the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. We teach about kings and battles and treaties. We teach about the evolution of feudalism and the power of the Catholic Church and the emergence of national identities. But we rarely teach that for hundreds of years, across every kingdom in Europe, teenage girls were married to strangers and then forced to perform or endure sexual acts in front of witnesses who recorded the details for state archives. We rarely teach that this was not an aberration but the norm, that it happened to queens, to duchesses, to the daughters of the most powerful families in Europe. We rarely teach that the historical record is full of evidence of this practice, because the men who documented it saw nothing wrong with it. They described it the way we might describe a coronation ceremony or a treaty signing. A necessary formality. A tradition. And by not teaching this, by not confronting the systematic nature of this cruelty, we allow ourselves to maintain comfortable illusions about the past. We can pretend that medieval society, for all its faults, still operated according to recognizable moral principles. That power, even absolute power, was constrained by honor and religion and the bonds of family. That the phrase royal wedding meant something sacred rather than transactional. That queens at least were protected by their status. But none of this is true. The higher the status, the more valuable the woman, the more thoroughly her body and her will were obliterated by the machinery of dynastic succession. If this story has left you unsettled, If the details have made you question what else we have sanitized in our understanding of power and history, then you are beginning to see why these truths must be told. Like this video. Not because the algorithm rewards engagement, but because every like is a small act of refusal to let this history be forgotten again. Share it. Share it specifically with those who still romanticize medieval monarchy, who speak of tradition and heritage without understanding the cost paid by those who had no choice but to participate. Subscribe to this channel, because the work of excavating these silent stories, of confronting the machinery that ground human beings into instruments of power, is ongoing and necessary. The past does not stay buried simply because we stop speaking of it. The mechanisms of control evolve but rarely disappear entirely. And until we can look directly at what was done, until we can name it without euphemism, until we can honor the suffering of those medieval queens by refusing to call their trauma tradition, we remain complicit in the silence that allowed this practice to continue for centuries. Only by telling these truths, by stripping history of its disguises and demanding that we hear the voices of those who were never permitted to speak, can we begin to understand how power actually functions and what it costs to maintain the illusion that cruelty, when wrapped in ritual and sanctioned by law, stops being cruelty and becomes something we can simply file away as the way things were.